Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. My afternoon exercise walk with my very expensive earring. So here I have animal friends, and I made friends with them by spending time with them and demonstrating my interest in them and being patient. My interest is not ordinary in that I'm not just after a photo opportunity or formal understanding, right? Like the kind that most biologists seek. Oh, here's a crow on the ground. I mean, a hawk on the ground. And it's eating. In the afternoon sunlight. It may be grabbing worms. Beautiful. Of course, I'm interested in these animals as well, but they're a bit more difficult to establish a relationship with. And again, with them, I'm not really interested in photo opportunities. That was just, I came around the corner and saw the hawk, so I thought I'd share it. But what I wanted to talk about is there's a pair of animals who I'm friends with, and one of them is significantly more timid than the other. The other is significantly more intrepid than the reserved one. And they both know me well. They've had time to see that I'm not attempting to trap them or interfere with their lives. Rather, I'm hoping for companions, and they like companionship too. They like my companionship. So we usually spend a little time together when I visit. But the important thing, and the reason I mention them, is that together they form a union, and the intrepid one competes against the reserved one. And the intrepid one is obviously more capable of obtaining physical benefits from the relationship because it's intrepid and it's willing to have a little conflict and a little danger and so on. Yeah. But what I noticed is that they both depend on each other. The intrepid one hitchhikes on the reservedness of the less intrepid one, the less audacious one. And the reserved one also hitchhikes on the sensing and activity of the more intrepid one. And so together they are much more than they could ever be apart. And they teach me all kinds of things. Some of them don't fit into language. But I learn by spending time with them and seeing how they relate with each other and with me and with the living place that we share. and they are my good friends. The important feature that I want to highlight is this sort of bipolarity, right? And how they work together in the same way aspects of ourselves, of our own interiority, our humanity, our animalness, our more than humanness, our nature, has something analogous. Many of our finest aspects and faculties as humans are shy. And unless they find themselves either in a moment of opportunity or a context that is supportive, they hide. Yeah, these senses, feelings, ways of being in the world, ways of being human, ways of being in relationships. And I don't want to give the impression that we're so simple that we just have two conflicting aspects that also cooperate. And this is, one of the narratives we've inherited from neuroscience and psychology and so on. And it's not a terrible model, but it's not sophisticated enough to capture what it's orbiting very well. Though again, it's useful, and I don't want to dismiss it. I just want to make it clear that our minds and our souls and our emotional selves and our biological selves, there are many different facets of our humanity, not one or two. And in fact, facets emerge and dissolve according to habits, timing, because everything in nature hitchhikes on opportunity. And this is important because if you want to live in time space where things are unpredictable and often opportunity or threat is momentary, it's important to have a sophisticated way of sensing and responding to this, to changes, to rhythms. The rhythms of the moon cycles, the rhythms of the sun cycles, the rhythms throughout a single day, the rhythms in a single hour, the rhythms in a moment. Because you see, the animals don't live in the same temporal extent that we do. Their temporal extents are different from ours. The birds have a very expedited sense of temporality. They don't live for 70 years, most of them. And so their world and their timelines are vastly faster than our own. Smaller birds more so, larger birds less so. You can see, if you just watch a hummingbird, that the way it's in the world of time is completely different from the way I am, or even a sparrow is, which is only a bird maybe twice as large as a hummingbird most of the time. So the topic I want to introduce today relates to this issue of different aspects of ourselves that are both in competition and rely on each other, although one of them relies far more deeply on its origin than the other does on its progeny. Or so I will frame it. And the topic relates to the distinctions between our waking mind and its faculties and assets, expectations and habits, ways of being a mind, and our dreaming mind and its faculties and habits, expectations, desires, right? Because each of these aspects of our mind has priorities, and they differ dramatically. And because I want to talk about a very specialized aspect of this relationship that I discovered over the past year, with the help of some others, the perhaps inadvertent help of others, I'm going to limit the scope to a specific set of concerns and observations that I've made. Now, I've been very fascinated with dreaming since I was young, although I think we're inclined to accept the proclamations of adults when we're little, right? So if they tell us, oh, those are just dreams, don't pay any attention to that, it's just your imagination, and so on. A child with good parents who trusts them is likely to take that on board, right? So I did, somewhat. Except that I was aware that there were different kinds of dreaming. And so it was very clear to me that the word dream doesn't just refer to one thing. Though we can encompass all of the phenomenon with one thing, one word, the same way we do with humans, right? And the language is very deceptive because it gives us the impression that if we know what to call it, we understand what it is the tag refers to much more deeply than the tag itself allows. And in this case, the tag doesn't do anything. It's like any other tag. If we don't understand, for example, that there are different kinds of dreaming, then we'll just think, oh, all this stuff is just dreaming. It's not so. That's not even possible. I mean, it's only possible in language, right? So, as I mentioned, life hitchhikes on rhythms. Rhythms help us all the time. And they hinder us too when they become desynchronized from each other. And most of us are aware that we have circadian rhythms, the rhythms according to which we sleep. When do we sleep in the day, right? In the 24-hour span, what's the sleep window? And for each of us, this changes and differs throughout our lifetimes, and some of us have terrible trouble with it, and so on. And many of us are probably struggling now with peculiar problems with sleep and dreaming due to the pandemic, which has changed our social, vocational, and behavioral rhythms. So I became very interested in a specific phenomenon, which is the emergence near the end of a dreaming cycle of a threat. Now, there's lots of different kinds of ways this plays out. But I and others that I know have had experience of a particular kind of presence in the dreaming world. And it can take various forms. But often it takes the form of an unexpected interloper, right? Essentially an invader of some kind. And the people that I've spoken with often speak of feeling very angry suddenly or outraged at this presence in their dreaming, or frightened and paralyzed. And almost always the emergence of this interloper, it signals the end of the dreaming cycle. And it has peculiar qualities in the dreaming context. Not only is it unconcerned about threats and violence and weapons and such, it wants to fight, right? It would like to fight. And it would like, in a sense, presuming it has its own interiority, which I'm not presuming, actually. I'm just using language this way. it's resistant to most strategies of dealing with it, right? And it's expertly resistant, so that if someone attacks it, that will often make it happy, and the attacks don't succeed. They don't penetrate. They don't help get rid of the invader presence. And it can be a person or a situation, but often it's a person. And sometimes they're armed with a gun or something. Or it might be someone that someone's had a lot of trouble with in their life, emotionally. This person shows up, there's anger in the dreaming. Maybe someone's trying to yell or scream and they can't. Or they try to hit the person and the other person, the invader, just laughs, is entertained by the idea that the dreamer will attack them. And then the dream usually comes to an end, in part because one of the best ways to end a dream is simply to introduce adrenaline. And our bodies do this on a natural rhythmic timeline to wake us up, to prepare us for awakening. There's a specific time of night. I think it's between 4 and 5 a.m. for many people, but there's a time of night where it's very common for there to be an injection of adrenaline. This causes the heart to race, and we awaken. Now, we're not aware of that in the dreaming context, obviously. We're not aware of our body releasing chemistry and such. But we may wake up a little bit agitated or feeling anxious. And I studied this phenomenon and also the sidedness of it. Which side of the room or the place does this interloper appear on? What do they do? And I talked with a variety of people, and most of them had had some similar experience. Not all of them. And each one's experience was somewhat unique. And what I learned some astonishing things during my exploration of this, and it's an ongoing project for me. But I learned some things that were unexpected. So, for example, I learned that we don't merely have a circadian rhythm. It appears that we also have what I'll call an onieric rhythm. Oneirik, which is a word referring to dreaming. And so there are situations where various kinds of dysregulation occur, or desynchronization of these rhythms. And our onieric rhythm can separate from our circadian rhythm, so that we are not dreaming at night. Right? And we may only be dreaming if we take a nap during the day or accidentally fall asleep. Or our body may expect to dream at times that aren't enclosed in the circadian cycle. They don't fall within the sleep window. And so it turns out that our onieric rhythm and our circadian rhythm can be dysregulated. And this is a fascinating situation, because an aspect of our mind is aware of this dysregulation. And it knows that as that continues, right, as the desynchronization continues to deepen, we are in danger, health danger, psychological danger, emotional danger. And so the aspects of the mind that sort of figuratively oversee these processes, right, they have abilities. And under some circumstances, when we are dreaming, when it is important that we perhaps should be awake instead, not just because there's something we have to do, but because if we continue to sleep in dysregulated or desynchronized ways, the link between dreaming and sleep will continue to break down. And that's very problematical for us because dreaming is necessary for survival. If we stop dreaming completely, we will lose the capacity to keep our bodies warm and other metabolic capacities, but also our memory and cognition will suffer pretty catastrophically very quickly. Research I'm aware of showed that mice that were kept from dreaming for 7 days died, and they died primarily of inability to maintain their body temperature. So it's a mammalian thing, not that reptiles don't have some similar situations. And so under some circumstances, an aspect of the dreaming mind, sort of a sentinel, right? A watcher, something that watches over these processes. Under some circumstances, this aspect wakes up and realizes, we've got a problem, right? So-and-so is dreaming when really they should be awake, and they need to be awake so that we don't crash the cycle further, crash the synchronization further. And in this case, under some circumstances, the dreaming mind activates. Now it could actually, it's unclear to me which of the two was involved here, right? This could be the intrusion of the waking mind into the dreaming manifold, or it could be a faculty of the dreaming mind. And it looks more like the first one, right? That actually, perhaps this is a faculty of the waking mind. But essentially what happens, and this turns out to be very important, is that one of the two aspects, this is very strange. I wonder why this is true. There's large chunks of sage all over the place here. Plant. I bet they just pulled it out. Yeah. I bet they just pulled it out. Well, I'm going to gather some of this, and then I will continue the video in just a moment. So it turns out that under some circumstances, either the dreaming mind or the waking mind activates an asset in intelligence language. And that asset is effectively a dream hitman. Its goal is to emerge within the dreaming context and present a threat so that the dreamer will respond in some way to this threat, either with fear or anger or both, or paralysis. And the dreamer may try to fight, right, the interloper. And that activation of anger, which is, I find, extremely uncommon for me in dreaming, unless something very unusual is going on. I'm almost never angry in a dream. Now, that may differ from other people's experience. In fact, I presume that it does, and perhaps dramatically, some people may have recollections of experiencing emotions in dreams that are troubling. But I generally don't. Most of the time, the dream is an adventure. And even if there's dire circumstances or crisis, I generally don't become frightened or angry, though I may be concerned, right? If things go sideways in a certain way, I may become concerned about that. But generally, not very often am I frightened or angry. Except in situations like this one. And so I've had this experience as well, where the interloper shows up and I'm angry and I'll try to fight, and usually it kind of laughs at me, and if I try to hit it or something, it doesn't work. And it seems entertained by the fact, the character in the dream is entertained by the fact that I'm getting, upset, right? And so this can become a common experience for some people when their dreaming mind their onieric rhythm gets desynchronized from their circadian rhythms, their sleep rhythms. And as I've mentioned, many of us are in this boat, so to speak, at the moment. So when I first encountered this phenomenon, I was very puzzled by it, and I thought, what's this about, right? Why are there these sort of bad people showing up and making people angry and frightened and so on? And each person's life and dreaming world is different. But I talk with a number of people about these things, and so we share, some of our experience with each other and reflect upon it together. And when I made this discovery that there's a kind of an aspect of the mind that is tasked with taking out, just like collapsing the dream world, right, into waking. When I became aware of this, it affected my dreaming. Right? And there were a variety of adventures that I had as I was learning more about this that were extremely instructive. Of course, I had to wait for opportunities such as those I here describe, right? I had to wait and hope and see what would happen if in my own dream something like this occurred, and how I might work with it. And because that's a very personal thing, I'm not going to tell long stories about that. I will say, however, that the moment of insight, right, when I realized, one of the minds, right, has realized there's a problem, and it's activating an asset, and the asset goes in to take the dream down. And in the dreaming world, that aspect is essentially omnipotent because it can destroy the whole world, right? With a few relatively simple moves. I mean, all it really needs to do is show up in such a way that angers the dreamer, the embodiment of the dreamer in the dream. And basically, if it just accomplishes that, it mostly wins. The dream will usually collapse shortly thereafter. And so the entire universe of dreaming just disappears. Right? It disappears into waking consciousness, which is very different. And in case it isn't clear which one of these aspects has precedence, the existence of the waking mind depends on the existence of the dreaming mind. And the structured sort of anatomy of the waking mind is the result of converting aspects of the dreaming mind to hard, permanent, sort of concrete structure, a process that happens in childhood. And as this process proceeds, most of us lose our imaginations, right? Or we lose huge aspects and functions of them. Now, when we were very little, we were pretty much dreaming while we were awake. Right? And we called this play. Yeah? Our dreaming mind was with us while we were awake. And at some point in our development, it mostly gets evicted to sleep. And in case this isn't obvious, there's a very resonant analogy here in the Genesis story where Cain, the kind of structured guy who's an agriculturist, a farmer, fights Abel, who roves across the land. Flowing water is associated with Abel, or Hevel. And Cain kills Abel and exiles Abel to the underworld. Well, what world is that? That's the dreaming world, also the world of death. And at this moment, in a sense, Abel becomes firstborn in the land of dreaming and the dead. And the brothers struggle, sisters, if you will, throughout the day, right? And then finally at night, the dominant, intrepid, audacious one begins to relax, and when it relaxes just enough, floop, the precedence flips over, the dreaming mind comes to life, and the origins of the waking mind become our mind. Now, the waking mind is a very tiny thing compared. It's a fragile, tiny, delicate, highly structured thing compared to the dreaming mind. The dreaming mind is vastly more resilient, yeah, and not reactive. But it probably doesn't like it if an agent of the waking mind shows up in the dreaming world with the intent to take that whole universe down. But this is what happens. Now, whether or not my story fits the facts isn't really important. In other words, whether I've got exactly the right narrative isn't really important. What's important is just to understand that there's an aspect of the mind that is tasked under certain conditions with taking down the dream immediately. And that aspect is, in fact, a world-destroying being. It's there to kill the dreaming mind so that we will awaken from the dream, and the waking mind will gain precedence, and then we can continue with the activities and or confusions of our waking world lives. Now, this is a really fascinating discovery for me. And when I first had the realization, I was overwhelmed with excitement. And it played out in various ways for a number of different people differently as we discussed and explored this situation. And I may make further videos about this, but one of my related concerns and interests is what happens if that aspect of consciousness or the mind, what happens if, normally what happens is the dream collapses, and so the interloper disappears with it, right? Because it's part of the dreaming manifold itself. So it's as if an aspect of the anatomy of the dream transforms into the hitman, right? I'm gonna take this down. And I'm only using the gender language here because it's a common trope. So it then occurred to me that what if that aspect crosses over into waking consciousness? You see, in the dreaming world, that agent, that asset, as I mentioned, is relatively omnipotent. In the simple sense, well, it's not omnipotent, that's not true, but it has great power in the sense that it holds the key to turn the dream off. And that's essentially a world-destroying move. The world of that dream will disappear. If it succeeds, which it normally does. There are exceptions. But what would happen if that aspect came over here in the waking world and found purchase in our minds so that it could sustain itself in the waking world as a fundamental organ of our mind, emotions, being, motivations, and so on? And one of the problems with that happening is that asset, it expects to be decisive in the sense that what it says and does goes, right? It expects to be powerful and to have the capacity to destroy the world if it doesn't like what's going on. And mostly it doesn't like what's going on because anything it's not in control of should go away. And this is the common feeling of the waking mind. Right? It wants grasping and control. That's not its only property, but it's a common feature. So what would happen if this dream assassin got loose over here in our waking lives? And one of the answers is paranoid schizophrenia. But there are other answers, like dictators, tyrants, childish men and or women who absolutely declare their authority, power, dominance, priority, perfectness, righteousness, and so on. And these all look to me like the behaviors of the dream hit man throwing a tantrum over here, because it can't simply just take the world down in a couple of moves if it doesn't like what's going on. But it's highly motivated to have a go at it. And this is a problem, because over here, that asset does not belong in our waking world. Right? That's something from the underworld. And it's not dissimilar to what we might think of as a demon over here in this world, because it's ordinarily in my hypothesis, right, in my theory, that asset is profoundly powerful. It just shows up and the world collapses and it wins, right? With some few exceptions. But in the waking world, it just shows up and gets angrier and angrier and angrier until its rage is absolutely volcanic. And what is the rage about? Impotence, right? The waking world is not like the dreaming world. You can't just touch a switch and destroy the whole thing, including yourself. And so many schizophrenics have fantasies of destroying the world. You'll hear them say things like, and I know people who've said these things, well, I think really everyone needs to die, and the world needs to die, and the solar system needs to die, and the universe needs to die, and I want to blow it up down to the tiniest particle. I want every little facet of reality obliterated, and even I want the obliteration obliterated, right? And this is a very strange thing for a human mind to be doing with itself, to put it mildly. And so this looks to me, it resembles what we might expect from the dream hitman, were it to escape its ordinarily useful context in dreaming and arise over here in the waking mind of an individual, or perhaps even a group of individuals. So in this figure, in this model, the dream hitman somehow begins to be able to preserve itself in waking consciousness as a faculty or organ, and it quickly becomes enraged at its own impotence, its the fact that it can't take the world apart just because it wants to. And the individual thus afflicted may become convinced that they are, either some kind of biblically messianic figure, or the Antichrist, or something like this. And you can see, the fingerprint, right, of this kind of confused, enraged, tyrant, infant tyrant, right? There's some kind of infantile aspect here. In extreme narcissists and other similar people, not that we want to go diagnosing people, but people like, for example, the present president and other people throughout history. I needn't name names. And so this looks to me like an attempt to embody the world-destroying figure of the asset, right? The dream hitman. Except that over here, it will actually obliterate everything if allowed to. And over here, it cannot be sated, right? It cannot be fulfilled. Whereas in the dreaming context, it takes the dream down, it's succeeded. And it goes with the dream, and we emerge into waking consciousness, and everything goes on as it would otherwise ordinarily do. But one of the things that happens, I think, in this model, if there's any validity to it, is that if it escapes the dreaming context and comes over here, the first thing it starts attacking is the mind of the person in whom this is taking place. Because that's actually the dreaming world. That's the scope of the dreaming world for that asset, right? So it will first attack the mind that is originating it, right? And then when that attack becomes like a ceaseless war that's constantly being amped up, inflated, then it will turn its attention to the world and to others, right? And it will become very concerned with scapegoating, right? Who in the world is depriving me of my potency and my power to destroy, right? Or who in the world is depriving me of my power and my potency to be a man or a woman or, whoever it is we are trying to be, a vocation, right? And it will build complex sort of inner court cases against various scapegoats, and those might be ethnicities or specific individuals or groups, institutions, and so on. And this is part of what often happens in the mind of a severely afflicted paranoid schizophrenic. And they may have inside them just this incredible boiling rage that there's no way for them to get rid of or to express, which, in case it isn't clear, is an experience of being tortured by one's own mind, right? By one's own body, by one's experience of being human. And I know people who have survived that torture for decades, and it's absolute agony for them. And none of those people I know deeply wish to inflict harm on others. Yet there's this aspect of their mind that is constantly, right, ceaselessly, it doesn't give them a break, sort of yelling in their head, kill, destroy, fuck these people, fuck that person, right? Like just really incoherent rage and demands for action. And there's different ways to understand this, and I'm not claiming that the model I've presented is the only or the most useful or clear explanation. I'm curious about the potential for this model to have some explanatory power in various forms of mental disorder or decoherence. So I've been fascinated by this topic this particular topic of in dreaming for about a year and a half. And I have to say, the moment when I had the initial insight that the interloper was an asset of either the waking mind or the dreaming mind, tasked with, bringing the dream to a close because we're supposed to be doing something else, or our rhythms have become so dysregulated that we're in danger of reinforcing those dysregulations. What a staggering insight that was. And it resonated, right, really deeply with me. And still does, and with others who I spoke with. So for today, I mainly wanted to introduce this model and reflect on it briefly, so that there would be some record of this little discovery, and so that it might assist those who've experienced something similar, right? And it might reassure them that not only is this not necessarily some bizarre, metaphysical problem or whatever, which, in some cases perhaps it could be, but generally speaking, there's a much more pragmatic perspective that's sensible and functional, and doesn't require exotic narratives, right? It doesn't require metaphysical narratives. And again, not that I'm trying to dismiss metaphysics or anything like that. I just want to start with something very pragmatic so that we can begin to understand things like this together and continue to explore them together, to understand them more deeply. This is a nascent insight. It's still pretty fresh. However, it had significant consequences for me and others in our dreaming experience when we began to explore it. And it may go some way toward explaining the bizarrely tyrannical, world-dominating aspect of people who have done great harm to human society and culture for the sake of their own aggrandizement. So there's a real world analog of this dreaming world phenomenon, and I find that profoundly intriguing. Perhaps you do too. So for today, I think I'll end there. But I'm grateful to have had this opportunity to spend time together and explore briefly some of the anatomy of the relationship between our dreaming and waking minds and its possible impact on the waking world. Because believe me, if that thing gets loose over here, we're in trouble. And of course, we're in trouble. So thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time. And I wish you every good thing for you and those you love, those who love you. And more soon. Bye-bye for now.